Dear students, here we are again. The next session is about collecting and museums. The modern museum is, by definition, dedicated to research, preservation, and education. That means the job of modern museums is to preserve precious or rare or important objects, to make them available to scholars so that we can find more about them, and to make them accessible to the public so that we all can learn about them. That's the idea. And it implies two important things. A, the museum has a double character as a research institution, and also it needs, or it should be, public in whatever way. It is in the service of the public. And that is what makes the difference between a museum and a private collection, even though private collections sometimes are open to the public too. The origins of modern museums go back to the 16th century. Of course, collections have existed before that. And maybe collecting even is part of being human or a great ape. I'm sure you all have your own small private collections, right? When you tidy your flat, then there's always somewhere a box with very important stuff that you cannot throw out, though it is not directly useful. You know what kind of box I mean? Most people have that. Somewhere where you have all kind of letters, old cinema tickets, or maybe you're collecting keys. I know a lot of people who collect keys or cups or, I don't know, stamps, whatever. I'm sure you all have your private collections of precious objects that you hold on to. So we know there were collections in antiquity too, but the beginning of the European style museum go back to the 16th century to the so-called Cabinet of Curiosities or Cabinet of Wonders, which wonderfully describes what these cabinets were all about. They were very, very different from our modern museums, because if we were looking at them today, we would say, wow, this is a great collection of strange objects, but, you know, is there any sense in this? Can somebody please come and tidy up a bit? Because this is just a mumble jumble of really strange stuff. It's all going every which way. By modern standards, cabinets of curiosity were chaotic. Though there has been a lot of research into this in the last decades, and actually, cabinets of curiosities were highly organized, highly hierarchized, and what we would perceive of as chaotic is the fact that they brought together objects from all categories of knowledge and from all over the world. They were a microcosm, they were universalist, they have been called a theater of the world, and actually they tried to contain a model of the world. To give you an impression, I've brought you an example. This is an anonymous print, actually a frontispiece from a book about Ferrante Imperato's Cabinet of Wonders from 1590. And it is the oldest depiction of a Cabinet of Wonders that we still have. And you can see here, you see the space, you see it is a small to medium-sized room. You have cabinets, all around the walls. And in the open cabinets, you see all types of boxes and containers in which may preserved every kind of thing. You see stuffed birds, you see preserved animals, especially animals from the sea. On the ceiling, you see the alligator hanging head down from the ceiling. You see on the right-hand side, you can see lots and lots of books, an entire library. And in the window niche, you can see two stools where obviously people can sit down to study, select objects from this over-rich and and abundant collection of seemingly disparate and objects that appear not to belong together much. And of course, quite important, you also have visitors. You see these elegant men. These are not workers. These are elegantly dressed guys from a higher stratum of society who are obviously being shown around by a guide person who is dressed slightly more modestly, with a pointer, a long pointer in his hand, who's obviously pointing out singular objects on the ceiling at this moment. And you can see how they are in different poses of contemplation, of amazement, of see this raised hand, how he's pointing his finger, look there. So you can actually see the element of wonder taking place in this small, stuffed, confined space, which however seems as if it were containing the whole world. So, what have we here? Why do we get an impression of chaos? I've brought you another example. This is by Domenico Remp, Cabinet for a Chamber of Wonders. This is from the 1690s, all on canvas. It's if you go to Florence, don't miss it, because when you go to Florence, you will probably go to all the big museums like Palazzo Pitti and the Uffizi and so on. But this really, really beautiful piece is in the rather hidden museum of the Opificio delle Pietre Dure. Opificio delle Pietre Dure. So go there and have a look at it. This was actually very fashionable at the time. A painting of a cabinet out of a cabinet of wonders. And when you have a look at the objects, again, you get this feeling of abundance, of strangeness, and I'm sure, I when I see this kind of painting, I love these. I always want to, open the door and look at these single objects and find out more about them, because they're so mysterious, and the mixture is so inspiring and but also so contradictory. Why do we find this contradictory? Let's have a look at this. So we see on the left-hand side, or actually on both sides, on the doors, we have obviously paintings. We have branches of coral attached to the doors. We have something like medallions or so. On the right-hand side, we have a print pinned over one of the paintings. And if we then go into the deeper recesses of the cabinet, there is a skull, there are more corals, there seem to be optical instruments, there's a letter in the front, or a kind of document kept in the left door in the front. You have then on the middle shelf, you see two objects on the left and right. These on the left and right, these probably ivory objects. These are this is especially intricate carving, which were kind of standard in every good cabinet of wonders. You have a portrait, you have miniature paintings, you have more paintings, more corals, more probably antique medallions or cameos, and on the lowest shelf, you have an egg and more stuff from the sea. And in the front, you have an ink pot with feathers and ribbons and something that looks like a watch. And this is not everything that can be discovered there. There is even more to be seen. By modern standards, we feel that this is, as I said, I'm repeating myself, but of course we think this is intriguing, this is inspiring. We can still see that, but however, it is also chaotic. Why? Because in our modern understanding, we expect objects to be kept according to categories. We do not normally keep oil paintings next to corals or next to preserved animals. We do not normally mix historical letters with eggs, or we do not mix antique cameo carvings, like stone carvings with mathematical instruments or physical instruments like a sextant or a watch or whatever. We do not normally put these things together. However, this is the specialty of the Cabinet of Curiosities. It combines all these objects. However, what looks like chaos is actually a very organized and hierarchically organized order of things which combine normally objects from nature, starting with objects from geography, stones, fossils, then animals from the sea, from the land, preserved animals, and also anatomy models. They preserve objects which combine nature and art. And interesting, the fossils are seen in that category, but also antiquities because they come from the earth. And also objects from nature that have been enhanced by human ingenuity. For example, these kind of objects, if a tiny face carved into a walnut or rock that is half natural and half carved and so on. And then you have art objects, which are what we normally think of as art objects now, like painting, sculpture. And then you have machines. And all these belong together and might be found in the same small cupboard, or might be found organized in different cupboards, but all seen as belonging together as components of the world. Because the plan of the Cabinet of Curiosities was no less than to unite all appearances, all phenomena of the world in one small room. And isn't that a charming idea? And also, it's enticing. Of course, that's an idea that you could only have in the 14th and 15th and 16th century, when people still had the idea that knowledge was, in a way, limited, that it was actually possible to unite the knowledge of the world in one room. It's kind of an analog internet. That's what was the idea. Only it was, finite. And we have very, very interesting attempts at how to organize the multiple objects that made up a Cabinet of Wonders. And these were always attempts at hierarchizing the innumerable, fascinating, and wonderful phenomena of the world, starting with geography and ending with mechanics. And they were seen as connected, as all belonged together. It all came from one source, and that was probably God. The interesting here is that the Cabinet of Wonders, or Cabinet of Curiosity, had actually three purposes. One was actually a kind of contemplation, a contemplation of the world's wonders, a feeling of awe and delight at the thought of all the incredible, varied and fascinating and strange things that make up the world. Then there was research and entertainment, which before the 19th century kind of belonged together, and I think that's an excellent idea that research and entertainment should belong together. And then it was, of course, also about representation. It was also about power and territory. Because, obviously, bringing together a collection as that, a collection containing objects from all corners of the earth, was a costly thing. You needed the space for it, you needed to be able to afford the objects, which was easier for the crowned heads in Europe. But also, the Cabinet of Wonders was considered to be a model of the universe. It was considered to be a space that contained the world in miniature. And of course, whoever owned that world in miniature was, in a way, a lord over the world. So it was also a sign of power. It's a bit, this is this typical Renaissance thinking. For example, Charles V, the important Habsburg emperor, he was a clockmaker. That was his hobby. He liked working, he liked making clocks. He liked taking clocks apart and putting them back together and building new ones and so on. And this was considered to be a very adequate hobby for a monarch. Why? Because the clock was seen as a model of the universe. The universe was a clockwork, a perfect clockwork designed by God. And whoever tried to understand the smaller but also quite complex works of a small worldly analog clock was trying to get closer to the thoughts of God when God was creating the universe. So this was also very similar. Yeah? A fascination with mechanics could be seen as a religious pursuit, as the contemplation of the wonderfully perfect mechanism designed by the Creator. And so it's no surprise that some of the most important and well-known collections were in the hands of kings, mostly, or princes. For example, there is the castle at Ambras in Austria, which contained, in the 15th and 16th century already, contained the largest collection of American native feather objects collected by the Austrian prince. And here comes already the problem. Probably stolen or bought at very low prices from Incan and Aztec persons in the Americas. Another famous collection was the one run by Rudolf II in Prague, who was considered a madman because his collection grew so large and seemed so impenetrable, but actually turned out to be extremely well organized when looked at later. Very important collection in Petersburg, the collection of the Royal Society, or the Green Vaults in Dresden. So if you have an occasion to go to Dresden and see the Green Vaults, wonderful. However, if you want to get an impression of what a cabinet of curiosity looked like before the modern museum, Flensburg is actually a good place to start. We do not have a cabinet of curiosities anymore in Flensburg, but there is the Museumsburg, which was founded much later, like in the 1880s. However, it still retains some of that original character because it has this universalist approach. Even though it is a museum, as I said, founded in the late 19th century, it is a place where you can find a collection of gull eggs, more or less in the same building with a collection of expressionist watercolors. I like it very much. It has its very own special character, and if you want to understand something, if you want to catch a glimpse of that charm of the universalist idea of the cabinet of curiosities, have a look at the Museumsburg in Flensburg. You can get a pretty good idea there. However, if you can manage to go to Dresden, better. The collection in Prague isn't there anymore. It was taken away in the 30 Years' War by the Swedes, and most of it is now in Stockholm. But however, try Dresden. That's the closest. Or go to Petersburg, which is always worth a trip anyway. So, as I said, sum it up. Cabinet of Curiosities, 15th, 16th, 17th century, united objects from all categories, from all fields of knowledge imaginable. The idea was to contemplate the wonders of the world. The idea was research and entertainment, and of course it was also very much about representation. The idea of dominating a model of the world being similar to dominating the world or dominion over the world. One very good example that may make this clearer, this contemplation and wonder, is that normally every really good cabinet of curiosity would contain so-called monstrosities. Monstrosities were, let's say, unusual bodies of animals, human bodies, and sometimes they were fabricated, falsified. They were called Wolpertinger. They were handmade monstrosities that pretended to be preserved monsters which actually had never existed. These are objects which we cannot find in modern museums anymore, except medical museums or in sideshows. And this is very interesting because it tells us a lot about our idea about nature. In the 16th century, nature was seen as a force that kept creating, that kept coming up with new ideas, new wonders, which was kind of an overflowing power, full of variance and new possibilities at all times. So unusual bodies, the famous calf with two heads or so, were less considered as mistakes by nature, but were seen as the power of creation, an example of the power of creation. And they were marveled at, and they were not rejected as disgusting or so, but they were seen as as proof of the ongoing or of the never-ending power of the life force. And this has changed considerably over time. Interestingly also, I mean, if you consider my choice of words, of course people at that time, 16th century, long before Darwin, did not think in terms of evolution. The evolution came along quite a bit later. However, they did not think in the static terms of 7 days of creation and that was it anymore either. That is interesting, right? I mean, that was the official version until Darwin, and for some people it is even now. The world was created in 7 days and that was it, and since then it has been reproducing and there's no change. But when you look at the cabinets of curiosities, there is an idea of dynamics, of ongoing newness, of constant new wonders happening in nature, which is very interesting and kind of foreshadowing later ideas of evolution. At least that's what my professor claimed when I was in university. His name is Bredekamp, and he did a lot of research on the cabinet of curiosity. Which is one reason why I'm going on about it, but it's actually an interesting example. So it worked like that until the 18th century, and then the whole thing slowly went out of fashion. Why? Well, for one, with the 18th century, Cartesian thought, the thought of Descartes, became quite important, which is all about utilitarianism. You know, what serves a purpose and what doesn't. And this boundless playfulness, this idea of wonder, the wonder at the bounty and abundance of the world, did not really fit into 18th century ideas anymore. And also we have the beginning of industrialization, and the equality with which things were considered and contemplated in the cabinet of curiosities did not fit into 18th century's ideals anymore either. Because by the 18th century, with the beginning of industrialization, there started the discussion or the assumption that machines were much more important, more useful, and more substantial than art. That's an 18th century thing. This debate started then. Also, another thing that started only slightly later, is imperialism. What do I mean? Well, as I said, look at Castle Ambras in Austria. They had this huge collection of feather objects from the Americas. And these objects were called exotica, so exo from the outside, Latin from the outside. They were considered strange. But then, of course, everything in the Cabinet of Curiosities was strange. And they were displayed together equally with everything else there. So feather garments from Peru were shown right next to the precious garments the prince's ancestors had worn. They were kind of on the same level. Like it was all garments, okay. And some were exotic garments and some were Austrian garments, and they were all shown together as one collection. So, of course, we have here an underlying theme of colonialism, because in most cases, the original owners of these feather garments would not voluntarily have parted with them, just as the Prince and Umbras would not have liked people from the Americas to come and take away or buy at a very low price his ancestors, special diamond-studded waistcoat. However, the way of looking at them had an aspect of equality to it. When you look at the whole world and wonder, then there is no strange and not strange. There is just everything is wonderful, everything is amazing, and we see it all next to each other, and it all fills us with amazement at the richness of the world. And so there is a kind of appreciation for it. There wasn't a categorization as this is cultured and this is barbaric, as we had it later on. There isn't an idea of, there is no hierarchy. There is no hierarchy. It is all considered, contemplated on the same level. And actually that is, post-colonial theory says that the one thing that can help us to get over racism and post-colonialism is interracial desire. And there is an aspect of interracial desire in there, the curiosity for the other, the respect, the admiration for the other, the longing for the other, the longing for the thing you do not know, for the inspiration it can give you, for the freedom it can give you, the freedom from what you know. This changed dramatically with over the course of the following centuries, and this changed, of course, with imperialism. This changed with colonialism, because the European empires that plundered the countries they colonialized and the cultures they subdued and overthrew. They invented an ideological excuse for what they were doing, which could vary in many places. I mean, for example, the Americas were, where was it? The Americas, they were declared virgin country. The idea was this is an empty country, even though there were a lot of people already living there. The same thing is already there in the idea, right? The idea, like 1492, America was discovered, except people had been living there for 20,000 years. And they had always known it was there. It was only that people from Europe hadn't known, or they had known but had forgotten about it, and they kind of remembered or rediscovered in 1492. It was really no big news. It was just big news for people in Europe. Yes. And we have that in many places, that there were made up religious excuses, cultural, political excuses, and legal excuses that were necessary to deprive other people of their rights and their property. There are many, many, many variants. It is very depressing to look into all of that, to look into this justification of theft and violence, colonial theft and violence. However, it is then mirrored in the categorization of the modern museums that emerged throughout the 19th century. Because during the 18th and 19th century, the knowledge about the world grew so much, and also the collections grew so much. Because imagine first in the beginning they had these small chambers that they filled with amazing stuff from whatever they could get. But imagine how much bigger the possibilities are if you can send out people to go collecting and buying and also stealing all over the globe. Of course, these collections grew immensely. So it was throughout the 19th century, it became virtually impossible to keep it all in one place. And also, there were new ideas about how to organize collections. The beginning of the modern art museum is actually, once more, at the same time as the beginning of the 19th century. And as we said, beginning of the 19th century is the French Revolution. And the first modern art museum was actually, or came into being, when the people of France stormed Versailles and took away the royal collections and made them accessible to the public. Again here, they brought the king's private art collection and collections to the Louvre and made them accessible to the people. And they framed it in a rhetoric of liberation. Objects of art had been liberated from servitude to the monarch and were now in the possession of the people. At the same time, just across the street, there opened the first museum that was organized according to chronology and style. Before that, in the Cabinet of Curiosity, everything was organized according to its origins in the earth or in the water, or to materials organized by material. And in the French Revolution in the 1790s, for the first time, we have an art museum which shows only art objects, antiquity, like statues, organized according to chronology, which is an idea that goes back to Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who is actually considered the modern founder of archaeology as well as art history. So, beginning of the modern art museum. In France, the first modern museum of art is actually considered the Louvre. And then this is also the moment when the big collections start being divvied up into the categories that we are now used to at different times. A beautiful example, for example, is Museum Island. That was built over 100 years, of a span of 100 years between 1835 and 1935, containing 5 museums, and planned as a three-dimensional book of a history of mankind. The idea was to build on the small museum the history of mankind in objects so that you could walk through it, which is also a universalist idea, right? It's bigger. They're not content with one small room anymore, but they need a whole island with 5 huge buildings. However, the idea is still, how can we assemble the world on a small place so that we can all see it at once? How can we make it accessible? How can we show it? How can we contemplate the whole world in one go? Which is also it's the kind of idea that we stopped believing in with the 20th century, when it became clear that the world is too large and too overwhelming to be perceivable for us in just one go. The interesting example here is, what I'm getting at is, for example, in Berlin, all our museums, the art museums and archaeological museums on Museum Island, but also our ethnographic museum, the ethnological museum, the Museum of Natural History, the medical collection at the Charité, and so on. All these, well, except maybe not the medical collection at the Charité, part of it. all these go back to the Prussian royal collections. All these came from the original, not Cabinet of Curiosities, but the collections of the kings of Prussia. And this is how it is in many, many places. So you first had a number of collections in royal hands or princely hands, and they were then at some point made the property of the people. They were divided into different categories, and they got their own buildings. And the unity, the universalist approach, was split up and splintered into different specialized fields. From that point onward, it became strange to look at art next to objects from nature. It became strange to look at antiquity together with dinosaur bones. It became strange to look at scientific instruments next to beautifully carved curiosities. And of course, that helped the development of research, that helped the development of our specific fields of research, but there was also something lost when the unity of knowledge was lost. And one thing that was lost, one very crucial thing, is, or was, and we're fighting to regain it, was the capacity to look at Montezuma's feather crown as equal to, as I said, Prince Ambros's diamond-studded vest. Because by the time that our different branches of knowledge were split from each other, the prevailing spirit was one of colonialism and racism. And by that point, everything that came from outside Europe was considered barbarian and of interest, of course, of interest, like the phenomena of nature, but not in the same way as so-called art objects produced by a so-called civilized society. I think it's lucky that by now this idea is beginning to seem strange to us again, but it was still very, very much entrenched in the 20th century. This hierarchy of the arts, this idea, European Western art is art. It's the result of deep reflection and high intellectualism and honed skills, as opposed to equally striking and maybe even more compelling objects from other cultures, which were considered to be the unconscious product of barbarian minds, of uncivilized, intuitive thinking. And they were not considered as complex objects that came from complex contexts and that, of course, contain equally deep layers of entrenched meaning and come from highly complex contexts. And this is still visible, for example, because I mentioned Museum Island as an example. I used to teach German history at HKW for the international students, and I mean really international, like you, but probably more, yeah, like you. People from all over the world. I mean, I had people from all parts of Africa and Polynesia and Indonesia and, yeah, all over Southeast Asia and everywhere, from Ethiopia. And in a city like Berlin, it is kind of stupid to study German history in the classroom when there is so much of it out there. So we studied for 2 days, and one day we went on a field trip and we just saw the city. And we went to Museum Island. And it was always kind of awkward when I took them there and had to say, look, this was a valiant attempt of people here 200 years ago who tried to make the history of mankind accessible in art objects on one small island. It was a great idea, but I have to apologize beforehand because the objects from your countries of origin are not here, mostly, unless you're from Egypt. And we have those, luckily we have those, but they're not here, they're down south in the Museum of Ethnology. And this division into two places for artifacts from human cultures is, of course, colonial baggage. It implies that the artifacts from Europe and what they consider their predecessors, or considered at the time of Egypt, Mesopotamia, were of a different order altogether than the objects produced by all the other cultures. It implied also that they had different and probably better and more profound knowledge, which is, of course, the root of colonialism, right? All this, but we gave you knowledge and the highways or electricity. This discourse of having to educate the uneducated barbarians and, relieving them of all their natural resources and their gold and their precious metals and their diamonds, by the way. Yeah. Of course, this is colonial. This is deeply political. We're still struggling with it. And this is, of course, hegemonial culture. This is the result of hegemonial culture, that the men who conceived of this wonderful, brilliant idea of making one small island a place in which all the cultural knowledge of mankind would be accessible. And they left out the majority of the world because it did not fit into their small, stereotypical idea of what the world was and what history was and what was of value. Of course they admitted that these other objects were of value too because they collected them, but it was not, not the same order, different. Because of course they also assumed that people and cultures outside Europe did not have a history. Like the barbarians are like nature, yeah, they are unchanging. Forgive my wording. So what hegemonial culture does is to make large areas of the world invisible, large areas of knowledge, of human experience, of beauty, and of ways of getting to know each other. And this is what becomes visible also in the history of the European Museum, sadly. In our very first session, we already mentioned the problem of artworks and artifacts from outside Europe that ended up in European or European-style museums coming from a colonial context. And for many of these pieces, the origins are unclear. By unclear, I mean it is not clear whether they have been stolen or purchased from people who stole them, or whether they have been purchased but very much undervalued. The classical example, the exchange against glass beads, gold against glass beads or something, or have been purchased under colonial law, and the question is if we still accept this as lawful or not. One famous example is Nefertiti, who came here in a completely lawful process that was agreed upon with the administration at the time. But Egypt in 1913 was officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but de facto under British dominion. Now, how are we to clear that up? The problem is also that it is very hard by now, after pieces which have been here for 100, 150, 200 or more years, to find out who would be the rightful lawful owner. So who do we need to give these pieces back to? And of course, there are also pieces which are here, which were acquired in lawful ways and which are here, rightfully here, and which I think we should be allowed to keep, to enjoy, and to be able to learn about other cultures also inside Europe. you see, this is a very, very hairy topic. Because, of course, countries who are asking back for their treasure are completely within their rights, and it should be in the interest of European and other Western countries to get a clean record and to make very sure that they do not keep things that are not rightfully theirs, that haven't been rightfully acquired, no matter how difficult that is. But of course, there are a lot of structural problems, and museums are structurally constructed to keep things, and you do not become head of a museum if you easily and willingly part with precious objects. No, it's structural, of course not. And it is also, you can of course hide behind this fact that it is so hard to verify the origin and to be sure of the rightful owners 100 and 150 years later. And third, which is also, which is really sad, a lot of objects that are given back are very quickly sold and turn up on the international market and then end up in private collections where they're not accessible to the public anymore, neither in Europe nor anywhere else, not in their countries of origin either, which is not a good solution either. I'm not saying that that is a reason to keep this object in Europe at all, but something is wrong there when countries, for example, in Africa, get their treasure back and then have to sell it immediately back to the West or to Europe, North or West, because they just need the money. This cannot be the solution either, because the idea, of course, is, okay, you need objects back that are part of your cultural identity. And I think, especially in Germany, people should understand that, because so much of our cultural heritage is still somewhere in Russia and so on. But I think we've more or less accepted that by now. I think there are legal treatises about that now. That was booty from the Second World War. However, as I said, it is a very, very difficult topic. What to give back to whom, and also to accept the decisions that are made. However, the context in which these objects are given back is still so much influenced by the facts of colonialism that it seems impossible to arrive at any kind of justice. And maybe we can talk about that in class. I'm very interested in your opinions there.